Well, we've got Henry Paul, the great Henry Paul of the Outlaws, on the line here today on Do You Know Jack radio show. Henry, welcome, and I'm looking forward to this chat, man. It's a privilege and an honor, sir.
Well, I appreciate the early accolades in the process. The great Henry Paul. I'm not used to hearing that. I'm used to getting a bunch of whiny complaints from band members.
Oh no. Well, the Outlaws have been around for over 40 years, and I mean, you've been in the industry for, probably, I would imagine now 45 years. So, I mean, that is an accomplishment in and of itself. So, even if you weren't a member of a highly influential band, the fact that you're still going in the industry is admirable.
Well, it's an industry that thrives on the word no. And they really do. They just love to see people fail. But the irony of it is if you succeed, they beat a pathway to your door.
Mm-hmm.
But they'd rather see you fail than succeed. But good God, heaven forbid you should have some success. And then they become your best friend.
Is it easier to fail or succeed in this modern music industry?
Well, it's easier to fail because if you do fail, you don't have the responsibilities to yourself and to your fan base and to your partners in the process.
Uh-huh.
If you succeed, you have usually record labels, band members, promoters, road crews, road managers, booking agents, a sea of appreciative fans that need, that want your time. And so that if you're lucky enough to have any success, your time is clearly parceled out in smaller increments, and you become sort of a target for a lot of people's, interest in you and wanting your time.
Well, that's what I get the impression is in the modern industry, you have to work a lot harder, right? I mean, in that golden age of the record business, one could have a moderately successful single and, almost sell, go platinum or gold before doing that many shows. But, maybe in this day and age, like I know the Outlaws are a huge touring band, right? I mean, you guys play up anywhere up to 150 shows per year, but I get the impression that would be part of your MO regardless of the state of the business.
Yes, and there's a time period in one's career usually where it is your time.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter how long you stay, and it doesn't matter how consistent your artistic efforts are, you have a time. For Bob Dylan, it was the middle 60s. For Bruce Springsteen, it was the early middle 70s. For the Outlaws, it was the middle 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And for Black Hawk, it was the early middle 90s. For the Henry Paul Band, it was the late 70s, early 80s, where you're only new one time. And once you're new, and you come out, then you're working on being old. And once you're old, you become sort of disposable and people are moving on. So it's a secular sort of a process that takes you from being new and exciting to sort of taken for granted to being old and irrelevant. Then if you hang around long enough, you suddenly become legendary. and it's the weirdest thing because for someone like me, you do the same thing every day, and nothing really changes from the standpoint of your input and your sort of work acumen.
Mm-hmm.
But the perception from people on the outside is significantly different from year to year, decade to decade. It's just, I think it's real important to know who you are and to have your own sort of creative agenda and have your own, criteria by which you judge your work and continue to work at it and put out what you really believe in and write the songs that really speak for you. And I suppose in a long sense of the word, over the long haul, it takes care of itself. People, after a while, they say, wow, Henry's done great work for a long time. You know, for me, I just try and every day we get up, we try and do good work. I know that every night we suit up to go play, we try and put on a great show. And over time, people grow to, I think, understand and appreciate you if you're consistent.
Well, yeah, consistency is definitely something that the Outlaws have had for a great period of time. You know, one of the things, you know, speaking of that newness though that you mentioned, one of the things that I find interesting about you personally is you grew up in upstate New York, and then you moved to Florida as a young man. But then, you know, somewhere along the way, you came back up to Greenwich Village, and you were, you know, sort of part of that singer-songwriter scene at the same time. So you've got that singer-songwriter roots, and then, you know, being a part of the Outlaws, you've had this, you know, Southern rock legacy as well.
Right.
You know, what artists were you exposed to in the Village at that time? You know, I think it was 1970. You were hanging around there. You know, did you get to? I know you played, you know, a number of some of the more, you know, famed venues, but you know, what other folks were sort of hanging around at the same time? You know, that you might consider peers or you know, even, you know, quote unquote legendary.
Well, an example would be, well, Jonathan Edwards came out in 1970 with Sunshine, and I remember I went to see him play at Folk City, and I was a huge fan of his voice, and he was a great rhythm guitar player, and he had written some pretty good songs, and that was very exciting. At that time, you know, Cat Stevens was a high profile, you know, singer songwriter of significant popularity. Carly Simon was sort of up and coming. James Taylor was at the top of his game.
Wow.
In the Village, you know, there was Bob Dylan had moved back to the Village from Woodstock and had an apartment a few blocks down from where I lived. And of course, he was, I think, instrumental in drawing me into the Greenwich Village, you know, stepping off point because of his you know, enchanted story of success. And while I was born in New York, I moved to Florida in the third grade. I was very deeply affected by the cultural change, and I assimilated my new surroundings, like you and I were talking about earlier, trying to fit in. And then when I decided to become a musician, a singer, a songwriter on a professional basis, I moved back to New York because the Village at that time was still sort of the creative launch pad and hub for music in general. And it's significantly different now than it was. I was at the very tail end of the golden years of the Greenwich Village music scene and artistic sort of scene. You know, nowadays it's a very affluent neighborhood where only those with extremely large incomes can afford to live there, and all of the bohemian character has been scrubbed clean, and it's just another sushi bar on every corner, and it's significantly different than when I lived there. But being an artist, you know, I was one of many young people that were living in New York and dreaming of becoming, you know, a personality with a record deal and a fan base. And moving back to Florida, I followed what opportunities were sort of presented to me.
Yeah.
I had an opportunity to go back to Florida sort of as a bigger fish in a smaller pond because I had had some success in New York.
Yeah.
I'd been to the Columbia Records studio, cut some demos for Don Ellis, the head of A&R for Epic, and I was kind of a celebrity in my hometown. And so Greenwich Village stopped being what it was.
Yeah.
But for me, once I had an opportunity to go back to Florida with a band that I'd put together in New York, I followed that opportunity. The Epic Records deal, I don't know what happened to that. I just packed up my stuff and went where I was where I was sure I had something good to look forward to, and kind of left New York in the rearview mirror. Once I got to Florida, the 3 or so odd people I brought with me, 3 or 4 people I brought with me, I met Monty Yoho, who was sort of put together as the drummer for the band. We were going to be represented by this manager.
Mm-hmm.
And through Monty, I met Frank and met Huey, and the original cast of the Outlaws sort of came together once I got down there a little later. But it was sort of a New York to Florida, back to New York, back to Florida. It was a little bit of, me going in circles, but all of those trips really were significant from the standpoint of the ultimate outcome.
Just a couple of interesting footnotes in terms of just even influences. You saw the Beatles' famous show at Shea Stadium in 1965, and you were also a few feet away from Jimi Hendrix' show in Florida. Like, wow.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, it's kind of like Forrest Gump. I was just I shook hands with Robert Kennedy. I watched Alan Shepard go into space.
Yeah.
I was within 3 feet of John F. Kennedy 3 days before he was murdered.
Oh, wow.
I just came from that time in history where it was very impressionable. And some of those iconic moments live much larger in the American historical landscape now, obviously, than when I was, standing out on the playground in my elementary school in Lakeland, Florida, watching Friendship 7 go into space. But, it was just my generation. That's what we did. That's where we came from, and that's what we were a part of. And I'm proud of it, I suppose. Honestly, the American automobiles from the year I graduated from high school in 1967 are some of the most valuable classic cars in the world.
Yeah. The
67 Corvette, the Chevelle Super Sport, the Chevrolet Camaro, the Ford, all those. That time period from where I come is so steeped in change and musical, sociological sort of upheaval.
Yeah.
And it was an exciting part of my younger days and helped shape me as a man.
Speaking about influences as well, I've read and heard in several interviews with you that Gordon Lightfoot was a major influence on yourself. Did you ever get the opportunity to meet and chat with him and sort of thank him for the great music?
I did. I got to meet Gordon in Nashville in 1998.
Wow.
He was in town mixing a collection of new songs. And I was downstairs in the same studio working. And of course, it was sort of rumored that he was there. And I went up and met him and actually got him to sign my Gordon Lightfoot's, not greatest hits, but his, what you call multi-disc sort of retrospective.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind enough to write some really, really nice note, a really nice note to me and sign it. And, from his debut album, Lightfoot, with Ribbon of Darkness and, Early Morning Rain. And he was just one of the most gifted singers and guitar players in that genre.
Yeah.
And his image was so strong. I'm going back before he started wearing that curly hair or afro thing that had that slick back blonde hair and a big Martin D28. We were just, as young people, absolutely smitten by him as a musical personality. And I think it's fair to say that to this day, he represents sort of the gold standard of that style of music. He's the most, even more so than Ian Tyson or other Canadians, Neil Young or any of the guys that came later. To me, Gordon Lightfoot is the gold standard Canadian / American folk artist, and I hold him in very, very high regard.
He always makes me think of the snow because the first time I picked up a copy of Gord's Gold, I went out into a blizzard in Regina, Saskatchewan, and came
Hmm.
back and had that album and was listening to it. And of course, he's got that wonderful song about the winter on that record. So it's like Christmas listening for me in particular. But I mean, you can listen to Gord's music anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, and he's not real sneering, and he doesn't carry a Bob Dylan sort of personality of attitude. He's more generic and more pleasant and more musical,
Mm-hmm.
and his songs just happen to be incredibly well written, and his imagery, in the early morning rain, it's like, come on. I mean, that is absolute, life as I know it, and it looms very large in my musical conscience.
Yeah. Now the Outlaws are sort of a a bit of a stew of different things because there's that southern rock sort of Allman Brothers twin guitar attack paired with maybe as well the vocal harmonies, and then they've got you with the singer songwriter thing. So but I mean the Outlaws are known as being immersed in the southern rock culture.
Well, yes, and it was sort of a hybrid, and there were two or three significant influences in the group that went into making it what it was, one of which was mine, the other two of which were Billy Jones and Huey Thomason. But the three of us had very uniquely similar appetites for music. We had very similar tastes in what we loved. And whether it was the Buffalo Springfield or the Byrds or
Mm-hmm.
Poco or the Allman Brothers, we all, as a group of people, we very much had consistent, taste in music, and it was very helpful because you took the two or three different musical personalities and you put them in one band, sort of like, and I don't compare us to this, but sort of like the Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and George Harrison musical personalities in one group. And it was, over time, they got to sort of put their musical personalities more on personal display.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the Outlaws were definitely a collection of singers and songwriters, and as opposed to Leonard Skinner, who was a singular sort of songwriter with musical personalities to kind of color that concept.
You, I mean, I guess this should go without saying, but you knew Ronnie Van Zant.
Mm-hmm. I did, and to know him was, as it turned, I mean, during that time period, he was just another, friend from a competitive, like-minded group of musicians in a band
Uh-huh.
that we were friends with. But his early exit immortalized him, and the intrigue from his absence compounds his celebrity. And because he's not here to speak for himself, other people want to know what it was like to be around him or be friends with him or spend time with him, or so it's an intriguing question. And he was a very thoughtful person. By that I mean he seemed to have a good deal of sort of the better part of a real vision of where he wanted to go and what he liked and what he didn't like and how he wanted the band to sound and
Mm-hmm.
what it would represent lyrically. And he was a very complex character, and certainly one that I was most impressed with, the fact that he had so much commitment to bigger concepts, and it wasn't just him living in the moment, doing this or doing that, or he seemed to have a bigger picture at work, and I picked up on that really quickly and sort of adopted that that agenda, because I could see how well it was working for him, and I considered him a great man because of, you know, how deep his line went in the water.
One of the interesting things I find about the history of the Outlaws as well is, you know, in the 1970s, the pairing of bands oftentimes, you know, weren't as genre specific as they would be today. Like, you know, today you might find a group like the Outlaws paired with two or three other Southern rock acts, and you know, but back then, like in 1976, for instance, you guys opened for the Who and did these massive concerts in London in front of thousands of people.
Right. Well, we were managed by the man that managed the Who, so we were given opportunities like that other people wouldn't necessarily get.
Yeah.
And while the Who and the Outlaws were dramatically, musically different in their personalities, we were both popular music groups with songs on the radio, and there was a certain sort of an attraction, I think, from the standpoint of the Who, to something different rather than another four-piece British group with a handsome lead singer. Part of the musical landscape for that tour was Little Feat and the Outlaws, and I think that the Who kind of spread their diversification and their taste in music around, you know, because it's like Robert Plant. Yeah, he was in Led Zeppelin, and he was the handsome, sexy lead singer in that band.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at where he's at today, you know, you can see his musical taste has and probably always has run to the more eclectic side.
For sure.
And I think that Pete Townsend has a very enormous capacity to love a lot of different things. And to our credit, we went out in front of their audience and played real hard, and that when we're able to get, you know, approval from their audience, which,
that's great.
Let me tell you something, it's not that easy.
I can well imagine. Well, you guys are known as a live band, and, you know, just November 18th, you released a double live album, Legacy Live. I guess maybe the question is, you know, about recording a live record. Is there anything that you guys would do differently in your approach, or is it sort of business as usual?
Well, now it's business as usual. Back when we used to make live records, you'd have a mobile recording truck with a 24-track machine.
Yeah.
An engineer in the truck, a couple engineers, one at the house console, the producer at the house console, and a couple, you know, second and third engineers making sure everything was mic'd correctly. And it was a very expensive and laborious and rather overwhelming project. Now you can hook some digital equipment to the output channels of your monitor engineer and come home with 24 separated tracks, and you haven't spent one penny. You know, you haven't spent a dime, and you have all the musical information that you need to make a live album. And so I think it's, you know, it was a part of the decision-making process to make the live record was based on that.
Yeah.
That we would make it because it was a cost-effective thing to do. And if you had a note that was sung ridiculously far out of tune, or, you know, you had something that you wanted to fix, it was so much easier after the fact in a digital format than it was, you know, going back in trying to fix something on analog tape.
Yeah.
I know Live at the Fillmore was edited and there were some repairs done on it. I know that Frampton Comes Alive had a certain amount of work done to it after the fact. Everybody sort of wants their record to sound as good as possible. The Eagles invested a great deal of time and effort on their record after the fact.
Yeah.
But we honestly, and I say this with all due respect to everyone's talent, we tuned a couple notes here and there. We moved maybe a drum beat around if it was, you know, ahead or behind, but we didn't mess with it too much. Everything was pretty well in the performance. We had the luxury of having a number of different performances to choose from. And the two evenings that represent the lion's share of the record were really well played. So we didn't have much work to do on it at all.
That's good. That's good. Well, that's a testament to the fact that you guys play so many live shows, and you know, you've got a lot of that material down.
Yeah, what's the old Bob Dylan quote? Know your song well before you start singing.
That's right. It's been a few years since the release of your last studio record, but I get the impression just by doing a little bit of my homework here that you guys are getting ready to you know, put out some new material.
We are. I'm in the process of writing a new record with a few good friends of mine that I love to write with, and you know, we're working on coming up with something worthwhile to say. That's always at the very heart of a song, is the message, and we're excited about it. You know, I mean, if the Outlaws can go in the studio and put together another really wonderful, exciting studio record, I think that it will further the band's musical legacy and put a very positive punctuation on the most recent tenure of my involvement with the group. And that's really why I work as hard as I do. I want to see the band's effort under my leadership, you know, reflect a high quality of work.
Well, on that note, pun intended, it's been great chatting with you today, Henry. I mean, definitely, as I said off the top, a privilege and an honor.
All right, all my best, and we'll talk again.